Well, if you want to shut off your camera too, we're going to go ahead and press play. Well, if you want to shut off your camera too, we're going to go ahead and press play.
Yeah, it's off.
Good evening and welcome to Climate Conscious Chats, a co-production of the City of West Palm Beach Office of Sustainability and the University of Florida's Thompson Earth Systems Institute. I'm Elaine with the City of West Palm Beach, and with me tonight is Brian, Stephanie, and Elise from the Thompson Earth Systems Institute. We're excited to bring you tonight's chat, Food and Livestock. We left some important links in the chat box for you this evening and encourage you to take a look. As we get started, we ask that you send us your questions throughout the program tonight using the chat box feature. And be on the lookout for a congratulations email tomorrow. We'll be choosing 2 lucky winners at random to win an Eco Prize Pack from the Office of Sustainability. If chosen, you will receive an email to the email address that you registered with. Tonight's Climate Conscious Chat brings you Bola Adeshogun, Director at Feed Systems Institute, Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems at the University of Florida. Bola, what can you tell us about food and livestock?
Thank you very much, Elaine. I am honored to speak to you all tonight. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'll talk a little bit about the role of food from livestock in nutrition, in cognition, and in sustainability. And I want to first of all talk about why we focus on animal source foods for sustainability. And then I'll go and talk about animal source foods and the environment and sustainability. And then I'll give you some examples of the work we do in 8 countries across the world in this area. And we'll finish with some take-home messages. So I want to start by defining sustainable diets. And it says these are diets that are protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems. They're culturally acceptable, they're accessible, economically fair and affordable, nutritionally adequate, safe and healthy, while optimizing natural and human resources. And I think you'll see several issues there. There's issues to do with the climate, issues to do with cultural acceptability, affordability, nutritional adequacy, and so on. And I think as we think about sustainability, we need to think about all these different factors. So I'm going to start by talking about this problem of stunting. And this is an important measure of malnutrition. And I call it a silent preventable tragedy because many people don't know about it, but it is linked to the deaths of about 45% of children. About 1 in 7 under 5s, about 144 million under 5s are affected. And this is a condition that affects the development of the brain and the growth of the infant and increases susceptibility to chronic diseases and affects school test scores and reduces the potential productivity of an individual when he or she becomes when they become an adult. And so it penalizes countries that have a workforce made up of people who are stunted in their childhood by about 10% on average. And when we look at the global prevalence, we find that most of the stunting in the world is still highest in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And as you can see here, 1 in 3 children is stunted in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And those children, the risk of mortality of those children is 8 times greater in Africa than in Europe, for instance. So we have a problem. And this stunting problem is caused by a number of different things, but one of the key factors is nutrient deficiency, is a deprivation of important nutrients that are critical to brain development. And if you think about the brain of an infant, of a baby, it's about the size of a fist and it's very small. So it needs high concentrations of very bioavailable nutrients, particularly during that first 1,000 days, which is critical to brain formation and can dictate brain function for the rest of life. So why are animal source foods important? Well, the World Health Organization has said that they are the best high quality, nutrient-rich food for children in this first 1,000 days. Obviously, breastfeeding is critical for the first 6 months, but from that point on till the end of the 1,000 days, and even beyond, these animal source foods are really important. And why are they important? Well, first of all, the protein, the quality of the protein, some people describe it as ideal protein because it contains all amino acids. And so it's very good for growth. But in addition to that, much more than the protein, it's the micronutrients that you get in plant source foods, in animal source foods. And please understand me, I am not knocking plant foods in any way, shape, or form. This is just about getting the important nutrients to the needy. So iron, zinc, vitamin A, these are some of the most deficient micronutrients globally. And iron, zinc, and calcium more are bioavailable from animal sources. That means even if you have plant sources with a higher concentration, the absorption may be greater from the animal sources. Vitamin B12 is one that you don't get from animal sources, and it's very important for the nervous system integrity. Vitamin A, the retinol, is the preformed source, so it's more bioavailable. And that's the same thing with D3. So I won't go over each of these in turn, but the main point here is that there is a cluster of very important nutrients that you get from these animal source foods. And to just explain this concept of bioavailability, iron is a good source, spinach is a good source of iron. But a woman would need to eat about 3 times more spinach as beef to get her iron needs met. This is a woman of reproductive age. And if she was getting that from for comparing liver to spinach, it would be about 6 times more spinach. And then for beef, it would be about 3 times. And the reason why you need less is this high bioavailability of the animal sources of iron. And that's because the type of iron is different. You have this heme iron, which is much more absorbable or bioavailable. Now, we talked about how important these foods are, but if you look at the levels of consumption in some of the countries where we work, particularly in Africa and South Asia, whether it's meat or eggs or milk, you find high levels of deficiency and low levels of consumption, primarily because people in those countries, particularly in the rural areas, they subsist on staple foods that are starch-rich, but don't have a lot of the important nutrients that are needed for growth and for cognitive development. And so this is a vital point that we're talking about here. And UNICEF has said that when we look at the consumption of important nutrients by children worldwide, 59% of them are not getting the much needed nutrients from these animal source foods. And so this is a very important factor, I think, that drives us to do the work that we do in the developing world. And you might say, what about fortification? Yeah, fortification is great, but most of the time fortification focuses on one nutrient. And so you're not getting the simultaneous supply of several important nutrients. And many times those fortification drives don't reach rural areas, or even if they do, they end once donor or government funding has ended. And in many Western countries like the US and European countries, for decades, animal source food supplementation subsidy programs have enriched children's diets, particularly milk. So this has gone on for many decades in this country. And this is critically needed in low and middle income countries. The irony is that these animal source foods are available in these countries, but they're usually inaccessible to the poor, to the vulnerable who need them most, particularly the infants, the children, and the pregnant and lactating women. Many times they're unaffordable, and many of those people will sell their goats and chickens and eggs for income rather than feeding them to the children, because they don't realize how critical they can be for the brain development of their children. Now, this is one project here that was conducted in 2016, which involved just giving 1 egg a day to infants in Ecuador for 6 months. And the results were really remarkable. because this problem of stunting, where children fail to achieve their high potential, was reduced by 47%. That was a tremendous reduction and perhaps unequaled since then. Wasting was also reduced by 74%, and this is linked to childhood mortality. 2 years later, the researchers went back to see if these levels of reduction in stunting and wasting had persisted, and they found that they hadn't, partly because they did not continue to consume this important source of nutrients. When this result came out, it made the news across the world because stunting is a very difficult thing to reduce. So this shows one of the areas of potential of these animal source foods. Another study I will just mention briefly was one done in Kenya, which is published in the Pediatrics Journal. And this one involved feeding 7 to 10-year-olds the staple diet, which is beans and corn. It's called githeri. And they supplemented it with either meat or milk or energy in the form of oil or a control. And this was done over 2 years. So what you have here on the right-hand side is the test scores of the kids accumulated over the 2 years. So those who got the meat, their test scores improved by 45%. Those who got the milk, their test scores increased by 28%. Those who got the oil, the extra energy, there was no increase relative to the baseline. And so this was a very remarkable study. And they found that those who got the meat, their cognitive performance increased. Raven score is the metric they use to measure cognitive development. Their test scores increased, as I mentioned. Their activity, their initiative and leadership increased, and their growth improved as well. Those who got the milk, their linear growth also increased if they were stunted, and their B12 vitamin status also improved. So this is just one example of the improvements that can be achieved in the diets of children with supplementation of these animal source foods when they're lacking in the diet. We did a review of several studies that have been recently published, and we found that increases in cognitive development across several studies when animal source foods were supplemented to the diet of children. Now, I want to talk very briefly about livestock and the contributions they make globally, or maybe particularly in the developing world. So in many countries, they're a status symbol. They're a source of wealth, and people who own livestock are seen to be wealthy. But more than that, they contribute significantly to the economic output of the countries. So 40% of the agricultural gross domestic product of many countries is due to livestock. And many families who are facing challenges to do with climate change, droughts and floods and so on, things like that, many of them who own livestock are able to bounce back quicker than those who do not. The manure from livestock is vital for crop production. Some people use it for buildings as a building material and as fuel for cooking. Many of the farmers across the world still use animals for plowing, so as a source of traction. And then about 2 billion people, over 2 billion people are still employed, particularly in developing countries. For instance, in Burkina Faso, which is one of the countries where we work, 85% of the population derive their income partly from livestock. Another role, an important area, is women's empowerment. In many of these countries, women are not treated equally, and their only source of income may be a few chickens or maybe a sheep or goat or cow that they own. And this generates the much needed income that they use to feed their family and to educate their children. Livestock are also very important for transforming byproducts and crop residues into nutrients. So in these developing countries, we can feed them cereal straws that are not consumed by people, and they can be used to generate energy and nutrients for livestock. And then there are ecosystem services. So there are areas that are not suitable for crop production where livestock can serve as a source of food. The last thing I want to mention here is in 2015, the UN developed the Sustainable Development Goals. And these are goals to transform the world by alleviating poverty, achieving zero hunger, and so on and so forth. Now, it's very interesting to look at those goals. And when you look at them, you discover that many of them cannot be achieved without a focus on livestock. Because when you think about their role in economic development in many low and middle income countries, they're vital. When you think about their role in nutrition, as I've described, they're also very important. As I mentioned, in regards to women's empowerment, education, poverty alleviation, they're very important. And one of the things that is also important is that livestock do contribute to greenhouse gases and environmental pollution. And so if we want to really tackle pollution and so on, we also have to address the contributions from livestock. Now, one of the things I'd like to mention is that many people in my field have been working for many years on strategies to reduce emissions from livestock. And this can be done by adding beneficial additives, by improving the efficiency with which nutrients are utilized, by improving breeding and animal health so that you don't have animals that are sick and emitting emissions but are not productive in terms of food production, looking at ways to recover nutrients and recycle them from the manure. And then there are some grazing systems and agroforestry systems that involve livestock, silvopastoral systems that even have a net carbon sequestration. So they are not emitting carbon, but they are sequestering. So these are some of the examples of strategies that are being used across the world. Obviously, there is a need for much more efforts to improve environmental stewardship from livestock production. This is something that was discovered recently, last year, that about 50% of the emissions from a cow can be reduced by feeding it a seaweed, and the reduction was about 80% in sheep. So there are a lot of different initiatives that are targeted at reducing emissions. I mentioned some of them. Some farms, not just here in the US or in Europe, or even in the developing countries, are now using anaerobic digesters, methods of converting methane into fuel, into the fuel for cooking and so on. And one thing that's important to remember is that methane is short-lived in the atmosphere. It lives for only a fraction of the time of compared to carbon dioxide. So if we are thinking about livestock numbers, as long as we're not increasing numbers, and preferably if we are reducing numbers, then we are contributing also to reducing environmental impact. Now, if we look at one US cow, it produces about 10,000 kilograms of milk in a year. And that same cow emits about 500 grams of methane. And whereas you would need 9 cows from India, or maybe 15 to 20 from Nigeria, to produce the same amount of milk. But because you need many more cows, you will be generating more methane. So we need to look at the need to feed the world with the growing global population and how we can address that hand in hand with improving environmental stewardship. So this is the background to our project. Our project is called the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems. And we're funded by USAID and the Gates Foundation. And Feed the Future is the US government's global initiative to alleviate hunger and poverty. And our goal, there are about 21 of these innovation labs at different US universities, and they work on hunger, poverty, alleviation, and improving nutrition in some of the poorer countries of the world. So for our lab, our vision is to sustainably intensify livestock production so that we have more food, but we do it in a sustainable manner. And our target is to improve the nutrition, the health, and the incomes and livelihoods of poor people in our countries, countries where we work. So on the right-hand side here are the 8 countries where we work, and we work along the field to fork value chain. We work on all livestock species, and we go into the countries. We went in there first in 2015 and asked, what are the main constraints to livestock production? How can we help you to alleviate those constraints? And so once we discovered what the constraints were, we then initiated research projects that would pilot solutions to address those issues. And this could be to do with climate smart approaches that would sustainably intensify livestock production and improve food security in these countries. So over the last 5 years, we have trained, engaged about 12,000 people and developed about 43 innovations that are being used in the livestock sector in all these different countries. And what I'm going to do in the rest of the presentation is just give you a few examples of some of the things that we're doing. So in all our countries, we really target women. And if you look at those that we have engaged, you will find that it's disproportionately higher for women, because women are disadvantaged in the sense that they are not treated as equals in these countries. Yet in terms of nutrition, in terms of agricultural productivity, they are much more effective at getting things done than men. So this is an example of a project in Ethiopia where, as we all know, with climate change, the risk of droughts is going to increase. So we're looking at drought-resistant sorghum lines that will allow year-round feeding, and drought-tolerant legumes like cowpea. And we've used those to improve milk production from cattle in Ethiopia. In Nepal, we developed an app for formulating balanced rations, because many of the rations that are fed to animals are not balanced. They involve a lot of waste and a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So this app helps us to determine the best combinations of nutrients from different food sources that are low cost, so that we can reduce these problems of emissions and waste and improve the productivity. And 94% of the farmers who use this app found an improvement in milk production, and you can see the percentage improvements here. And this is just a screenshot of the app, which is available in the Android store. Another thing that we've been working on is influencing policy in the countries. So in some of our countries, we have done national surveys to look at contamination of feeds with toxins, particularly plant-based toxins. And this one here is aflatoxin, is one that as climate change occurs and places that were cooler get warmer, is going to increase in incidence. So we found high levels of aflatoxin, and what we have been able to do is pilot some interventions to reduce the problem. We have also conducted the first national workshops in these countries to try and discuss different mitigation strategies. And in one of our countries, for instance, I won't name the country, the government has now activated a task force that is diligently implementing our recommendations. And they are working at that to reduce this problem. One of the challenges with aflatoxin is that it can be transferred from the feed of animals into milk and then pose a hazard to people. And so what we're doing here is reducing that risk by working with our partners in the countries. Another thing that we're working on is reducing the incidence of diseases. Obviously, if an animal is sick, it's not going to produce as much food, but it's going to continue producing emissions. So it's very important for us to curtail those diseases. And this is some work in Nepal, where we were able to reduce mastitis, which is a problem that reduces milk production by cows. It's inflammation of the udder, and it reduces food safety, reduces the ability to process the milk into yogurt. And you can see the reductions in cows and buffalo. Buffalo are also, in fact, the greater source of milk in Nepal. And so this is another example of the work that we're doing. In Cambodia, we are also very, in all our countries, food safety is very important to us. So we conducted national surveys to understand the causes of foodborne illness, and we've listed some here. We went into hospitals and tried to link foodborne illness to what people had consumed, particularly with pork and poultry. We discovered high levels of pork and salmonella contamination in the pork and poultry products that we sampled. And we discovered it cost $62 to treat each case. So very expensive, extremely expensive. And now what we're doing is piloting food safety interventions, things like plastic cutting boards and methods of handling these products that improves hygiene and maintains food safety. Another project in Nepal, this one involved empowering women by training them to become community animal health workers. These are women in rural areas who don't have the time to go to the government training centers to learn how to become community animal health workers and derive an income that way. So we provided them with iPads that had the curriculum, and they were able to train remotely. And in fact, 24% more of them who trained by distance achieved a completion compared to those who took the in-person classes. This is the last example I will give. This is a project we did in Burkina Faso in West Africa. And we had a culturally tailored behavior change intervention. What this meant was that we identified poor families and we gifted them 3 chickens, but we didn't give it directly to them. We gave it to them through a village elder, and the village elder had the family promise that they would give an egg a day to the children. And so we had that intervention, which is the full interventions here, or the chickens, but we also trained them about the importance of eggs in the diet and how to raise the chickens properly. And we had another intervention which was just focused on training alone without gifting of chickens. And what we found was that those children within a year went from consuming no eggs to 2 if they were just trained without receiving chickens, to 6 eggs per week if they were receiving chickens and training. And what was really remarkable was the reduction in wasting and underweight. And wasting, as I mentioned earlier, is linked to undernutrition, to mortality. And also the women. The women told us that once they started feeding the eggs to their kids, even their husbands were sometimes reluctant. But after a few weeks, when they noticed the improvement in the condition, in the behavior, in the liveliness of their children, they insisted on feeding the eggs, whether their husbands agreed or not. And later, their husbands came on board and saw the importance as well. Now, unfortunately, we're all facing this COVID-19 crisis, and it's affecting us here as well as in many other countries. In fact, it's projected to dramatically increase starvation across the world. Just like here, many people have lost their jobs, and so affordability of nutrient-rich foods, particularly animal source foods, has reduced. And then in some countries like India and Ethiopia, we're hearing myths that COVID can be transmitted through animal products. So this graph shows that only the very richest in Ethiopia did not reduce dairy consumption in May compared to the levels of consumption in earlier in the year before COVID hit. So again, these animal source foods are so vital, but again, COVID is worsening the situation. So I'm going to finish by just sharing a few take-home messages. Firstly, stunting affects 144 million children under 5, and it constrains their growth, but also their health, their education, their brain development, and their future productivity, and therefore the economic productivity of nations. Animal source foods, according to the World Health Organization, are the best source of the stunting preventing nutrients for these infants and also for pregnant and lactating women. But according to UNICEF, about 59% of children are not getting the nutrients that they can through these animal source foods. Livestock play a very important role in equity, in women's empowerment in these countries, in livelihoods, particularly in the low and middle income countries. And in these countries, they have large stocks of livestock which emit a lot of greenhouse gases. So what we need to work on, and what we're working on, is ways in which we can achieve food production with fewer animals so that we have less emissions and more food produced. And that's what I mean by sustainable intensification. And I think we all need to join hands and work together to achieve our shared goals of sustainability. And we need to focus on food security. We need to focus on equity, on livelihoods, and on stewarding the environment properly. So thank you very much for your attention. I will be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. I really enjoyed learning from you and hearing about all the amazing work that you and your colleagues are doing to try to help remedy the situation going on in developing countries. If any of our attendees here have any questions for Bola, please write them in the chat box, or if you're watching on YouTube, please write them in the chat and I'll ask them on your behalf. Our first question today actually comes from YouTube. Evelyn is curious, what can we do here to support better nutrition in the developing world?
So this is a great question. What can we do here? I think one of the things is to be informed about the needs and to the extent possible to support initiatives that assist in meeting these needs. We do have needs here in the US as well, but we live in an increasingly global world where what is done here affects what is done in other countries, and what is done in other countries, affects what happens here. And we have so many examples. So I think in whatever ways that you can advocate for improved nutrition in these countries, I think that would be a huge contribution that you can make. Thanks.
Isabella is curious, how does the amount of methane released from animals change as the animal becomes more sick?
That's an interesting question. Does the amount of methane produced change as the animal gets sicker? And I don't have an answer to that question. I would have to look into that and maybe follow up with you later on. But the point is that, let me just give it a thought for 1 second. The emissions of methane are a way for the animal to get rid of, it loses energy in that form. And I'm not sure that the emissions reduce as the animals get sick. And so one of the things that is vital is trying to ensure we have as many healthy animals as we can. And that's why we focus also on health interventions for these animals.
Thank you. Emmy asks, when livestock are fed seaweed to reduce greenhouse gases, did it impact the production of milk or meat yielded from the production?
Yeah, if I remember correctly in that study, there was no reduction. So the problem would be if there have been some interventions that we have attempted as people who work in this area that would reduce methane emissions, but they may reduce the digestibility of the food, the feed, or reduce the intake and reduce milk production or the growth. But in the studies that were done here and in other countries, what was fantastic was that there was no reduction in these animal performance metrics. And there was yet a simultaneous reduction in methane. So we always look at those things hand in hand. It's no good promoting something for reducing methane if it's going to go against our goals of improving the efficiency of food production.
Mason is curious, and Mason states, I know you touched upon this a little bit already, but can you briefly describe a little bit more about how you're getting locals to quote unquote buy into this new technology and new information that may be shared with them?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. It's very important to approach this properly. When we go into the countries, it's important not to be seen as coming in with an I know it all kind of mentality or a top-down kind of mentality. Some of those approaches have led to failures in the past and have led to interventions which were which did not target the most important needs. And so what we have done is when we go into the countries, we have stakeholder meetings with many individuals in academia, in government, in the private sector, civil society, and so on and so forth. And then we bring them all together because we ask each of them to help us identify and rank the main problems. And then we bring them together and ask them to have a discussion and a debate and jointly agree on the most important issues. And because we bring them together from the get-go, they buy into the project. And every year we bring them all back together and tell them, this is how far we're progressing with the project. And these are some of the things we're learning. So they're able to critique what we're doing. They're able to tell us, well, this is what you should now emphasize. And as a result of that, we have very strong buy-in. Now, we are still working to scale some of these interventions. The project we have has money to develop the interventions, but not to scale them across countries. So we just got a renewal of our funding for 5 years from USAID. And what we're looking to do now is do a better job of finding private sector partners, government partners who will scale these efforts that we are introducing. So we did some of that before, but we're working much more concerted way on that in this next phase.
And that actually touches upon Benjamin's question, which was asking, if you were to receive additional resources, whether it be funding or anything else, what more would you do with your efforts?
Well, thank you. You know, the needs out there are tremendous. And, you know, I'm not exaggerating. In fact, I can't exaggerate the needs. What we're doing is important, and we have a fantastic team of faculty and staff, and then partners. Like I mentioned, we have about 63 organizations in the US and foreign countries who work with us and get all this work done. So what we're doing is important, but there's still so much more to be done. The needs are great. We're only working in 8 countries. And in some of those, 2 of those 8 countries, we're not deploying across the whole spectrum of interventions. In Kenya and Uganda, we have a targeted project focusing on viral diseases of sheep and goats. So we're only, you know, I hesitate to say it, but there is truth in saying that, you know, we may not be just scratching the surface, but there's so much more to be done. And so investments in this area are critically needed to increase the scope and impacts of the work that we're doing.
Thank you. Michael writes in and says, I have read research that suggests mixing legumes or even other grain dust could affect the methane production from cattle. Do you have any thoughts on this research?
Yes, that's true. Mixing legumes, adding legumes to the diet will often increase the digestibility of the diet and reduce methane emissions. So that is one of the strategies that we use. And as I mentioned in that project I referenced in Ethiopia, we're using pigeon pea, but that was just one of many projects. In Ethiopia, we have another project using a combination of oats and vetch. Vetch is a legume. In Burkina Faso and Niger is the French pronunciation, we use cowpea. So these legumes are a very important part of the story. They fix nitrogen, so you have less fertilizer requirement. They boost the growth of animals, and then they also help to reduce methane. So yes, a really, really important component in all of this. Thank you.
Ethan asks, how has COVID impacted your ability to support these communities?
Yes, COVID, I used to spend half of my time traveling, and I haven't traveled since March. And the good thing is that we have regional or country coordinators in each country. Somebody asked earlier on how we achieve buy-in. One of the things we do is we don't do all the research ourselves. We insisted from the beginning that the research we fund must include US partners working hand in hand with focal country partners. So these would be researchers in the country working with people at US universities. And so you have people on the US side who may have access to the latest science, and you have people on the developing country side who have the best understanding of the situation, the context, and the problem. And so with having these two work hand in hand, we're able to deploy and to really tackle the roots of the problem properly. But it also means that when we can't travel, the work can continue. So we have weekly meetings with our regional and country coordinators, and they give us updates. They start with the COVID situation in the countries, and then they tell us about the progress of each of the projects. And they call, they phone, and when possible, visit those projects. So those projects are able to continue, even though we have not been able to travel to be there in person.
Our next question is, was there any observable reductions in any diseases during the trial of feeding seaweed?
So the aim of the project with seaweed was not to target diseases. The aim was to examine a reduction, the potential for reducing methane production. And before the seaweed study, a lot of the interventions would reduce methane production by up to 30%. No greater than 30%. So it was like a barrier. But this use of seaweed is showing that we can blow that barrier away and achieve much greater levels of methane mitigation. But the aim was not to tackle diseases.
Thank you. Sophia asks, what do you mean by beneficial additives to decrease greenhouse gas emissions from livestock? Can you help define this a little bit more?
Yeah. So thank you. There are a number of different types of additives. So the seaweed is one example I gave. There are certain beneficial microbes that can be added. So things like yeasts can be added to diets and can reduce emissions. There are certain plant compounds that are added, certain essential oils that can be added. There are certain pomegranates have been shown to reduce emissions. And then we also talked about legumes. So these are different things we can add to the diets of cows, sheep, and goats to bring down the emissions.
Thank you. We have time for just a few more questions. So we'll begin to wrap up with Alex, who asks, moving into the next iteration or funding, will there be more of an emphasis placed on ASF consumption messaging within all livestock projects?
So this is a good question because, I remember going to Niger and meeting with a group of men in the rural area. And I was telling them this story about the importance of animal source foods in the diet. And I was telling the men because in many of these countries, men get the choice portions of meat. And then the children may get some leftovers, and then whatever is left over from that, the women get. And sometimes these women need them certainly more than the men, particularly when they are pregnant and lactating. What these men, so I asked them, first of all, why do you eat? Do you understand the concept of nutrients? And they said, no, we don't. We just eat to fill our bellies. Okay. So I then tried to talk to them about nutrients, talk to them about animal source foods in the diet and how their infants and their children and their pregnant and lactating wives were the ones who really needed those. And I said, do they understand? And they all nodded their heads in agreement. And then I said, would they be willing to forego their meat to allow these people who are more vulnerable and who need it much more consume the animal source foods? And they just burst out laughing. And I was shocked. I was horrified. And it just goes to address the question about the messaging. That messaging is so important. And we have to do it in a culturally appropriate ways. In Burkina Faso, we use the village elders. In other places, we may need to work with the religious authority. So we need to work with whatever entity can help those people understand how vital those animal source foods are in the diet. I remember one top government official in Rwanda said, Bola, when you go around and you talk to people and you do this work, I give you permission to frighten them. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, the problem is that a poor woman would, do so much hard work to earn an income and then pay for her child's school uniform. And that child would go to school with a nice uniform, but with, these were her words, not mine, nothing in the head. And she was basically saying that it's so much more important to develop the brain and the well-being of this child than to buy a uniform for that child. And so many people are ignorant, are unaware of the importance of these nutrients. Even this past week, I still met someone who was saying the same thing I heard in Niger, that people in many of the middle-income countries, particularly the rural areas, just eat to fill their stomachs. They don't really understand. So behavior change messaging will be an absolutely important part of our next phase. Thanks for that question.
Thank you. And for our last question today comes from Elijah. Elijah says, I know you're doing a lot of really incredible work, but knowing it is an issue on such a large scale, what gives you hope for the improvement of nutrition in developing countries for the future?
Thank you. I think what gives me hope is that people are beginning to get it. And governments are beginning to get it. And once people get it, the transformation occurs. One of the countries our countries I love visiting is Rwanda, for instance. And they are exemplary in the way they tackle these issues. So for instance, when we finished the One Egg project that improved the condition of children and reduced wasting in Burkina Faso, they said, come and repeat it in Rwanda. Earlier on during COVID, when restrictions were preventing farmers who are, poultry producers from selling their eggs. And what they did is they bought eggs and they started to supply schools, supply needy children for free. And so I think as people understand, they get a change of mind about how vital this issue is. And that's one thing that gives me hope. So I think, what I think I would maybe say finally is, since you've all heard this, please join me in telling this story so that we can feed the world, but we can also be good at environmental stewards at the same time.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the time that you've shared with us today, and feel really lucky to have had that opportunity for you to share all that really, really valuable information. So thank you again.
Thank you.
At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Stephanie as she begins to wrap up today's presentation as well.
Thank you, Brian, for that. I appreciate it. Well, that wraps up tonight's Climate Conscious Chats. We hope you've come away with a deeper understanding of the dynamics and relationship between livestock and people around the world. Thank you, Bola, so much. We are so grateful for you and the knowledge that you've shared once again with us this evening. You can learn more about the City of West Palm Beach and their Office of Sustainability, as well as the Thompson Earth Systems Institute programs by following us on social media or by visiting our websites that you see here on your screen. And we hope you have a safe and wonderful Thanksgiving holiday. And with that, thank you and good night. Bye-bye.